live stream is getting ready. Okay, good afternoon, Golden Desert. We are really excited to let you see the 6 oratories that rose up out of our quarterfinalists. All of these competitors have already gotten their bid for the NIETOC, and I'll let our judges take it from here. Thanks, everybody.
You all good for me to start the video?
Yep.
I'm not a celebrity. I know, shocking. I might act like one sometimes, but the minute you put a camera to my face, things get ugly. Not me. Thank you. It's just the situation. And it might sound silly, but in today's smartphone-infested world, it's almost become a wordless condition that when out with friends and family, pictures will be taken. But for those who are familiar with me, my worded condition is that I don't really like being photographed. My dad tells me constantly, it's not that deep. Ashley, I agree. It's not that deep. I get uncomfortable when people take pictures of me without express permission. That's it. Please don't cross the boundaries I've erected in order to protect my own mental and emotional health. That's it. And yet, as a society, we continuously struggle with the notion of boundaries, whether it be setting them too liberally or not setting them at all, or being disrespectful of boundaries, either on purpose or on accident. And then this fight manifests itself throughout our entire lives, in our social and professional relationships, in our mental, and even in our physical health. According to the Huffington Post, 80% of chronic diseases are caused by lifestyle-related issues that boundary setting might solve. Jane Collingwood, a health journalist, states that boundaries are a measure of self-esteem. And especially coming out of a pandemic where so many are taking the time to reflect on themselves, it's more important than ever that we discuss boundaries. We need to remember that it's not our job to tell people what they are or aren't comfortable with, but it is our job to make sure we're letting others know what behavior we're on board with, and to make sure we're making others feel comfortable. So let's pick up that conversation by taking a camera lens to the causes, putting it down to look at the effects, and then walking away with the solution to our age-old problem that just won't go away. Boundaries serve to mark the limits of something and to tell us when we've reached that limit. So a personal boundary is a personal rule we individually create to tell others what our limits are, like refusing a hug or simply saying no. Often though, these responses are interpreted as insults that can be taken personally, but they're not. Psychotherapist and author Marlena Tilhan argues that boundary setting is more about someone telling you something about themselves rather than a personal rejection. Just think, let's say a friend offers you a slice of cherry pie and you reject it, obviously, because cherry pie is objectively disgusting. Are you rejecting the pie or the friend? Most likely the pie, unless your friend's name is also coincidentally Cherry. Similarly, when someone tells you that they're uncomfortable with a particular situation, they're not rejecting us as people, just the situation itself. So don't change who you are, just please stop giving me cherry pie, because honestly, I'd rather eat dirt. And some might also believe that setting boundaries is selfish. But setting personal limits isn't about being inconsiderate of others' feelings. It's about giving others the chance to be considerate of ours. As Christine Morgan, the CEO of the National Mental Health Commission, puts it, boundary setting is caring for myself. It doesn't make me selfish. I care about me, too. You're not selfish for telling your friend that you don't like cherry pie. You're just telling her what you do and what you don't like. And if you do think that's selfish, please give me your contact information, because the next time I get cherry pie, I'm just gonna send it all to you. The truth is, setting boundaries, understanding them, and making each other comfortable is key to a good relationship. Just take it from Matthew Bubalo, a licensed mental health counselor, who states that the ultimate goal is to live in a way that is most healthy for all individuals and groups involved. Boundaries are good for others as well. After all, a relationship is give and take. It's not give and give or take and take. Unfortunately, problems with boundaries cause a lot larger issues than simply, let's say, eating a pie that you don't like, for example. Even though in my book, that's honestly a pretty big problem too. But Not setting boundaries or not repeatedly reinforcing those boundaries leads to a constant hum of irritation. Often we harbor a secret resentment towards other people for making us feel uncomfortable, and we can then ruin all future encounters. This violation, according to family therapist Elizabeth Earnshaw, can lead to being cut off from others or enmeshment in both social and professional settings. Unhealthy boundaries have devastating effects. Research has shown that 60 to 80% of workplace problems are related to a lack of setting boundaries. Deborah Grayson Regal, the executive speaker and CEO of Talk Support, states that issues often arise when we wrongly assume our workforce just knows how to interact, not realizing that those expectations must be explicitly discussed. And before you downplay work culture, Gallup reports that unhappy, actively disengaged employees cost U.S. companies anywhere from $450 to $550 billion per year. And even our relationships are at home. A fulfilling relationship is one where we can be open to sharing what bothers us. We're able to be more comfortable, more trusting, and therefore more intimately connected. But our relationships with others, professional or not, aren't the only relationships on the line when unhealthy boundaries come into play. Our relationships with ourselves also take a hit. Boundaries are part of who we are as people, and having them repeatedly disrespected can tell us that our opinions don't matter. When this happens, as psychotherapist and public speaker Sherry Jacobson puts it, you're likely to constantly be at the mercies of others. You allow others to tell you how to think, act, and feel. We can lose our own sense of self, and this can lead us to believe that we don't even matter, which couldn't be further from the truth. Having a low self-esteem and a sense of being out of control of our own lives goes hand in hand with having lower motivation to take care of ourselves, which can then lead to the onset of depression. And now, knowing these consequences, it's important as well to remember that we strive to make others comfortable. As my psychology teacher would put it, this is an avoidance conflict. We don't want our own boundaries to be disrespected, but we also don't want to treat on others' boundaries as well. And now you're probably thinking that, Ashley, this sounds a lot easier said than done. Yeah, I can see it is easier said than done, but there is something we can get done to ensure that we set boundaries in a way in which they will be respected, and to make sure we're respecting others' boundaries and to learn how to respond to them in the proper manner. We need to each remember that everyone is their own independent person. And this can be taken two ways. First, in terms of setting boundaries. It's important to realize that you're in control of your own circumstances. Setting and reinforcing your own boundaries will remind others and yourself what you are or aren't willing to tolerate and be responsible for. For example, let's just say there is a boy named Bob. Really creative name, I know, thank you. And let's just say this boy named Bob just doesn't like being hugged. He realizes that it's his responsibility to communicate that boundary to his friends and family so they know not to hug him. He's taking control of his own circumstances and of his own happiness. But unfortunately, as Caitlin Killerin, the head of content at a health and wellness company, puts it, setting and communicating boundaries is only half the battle. It's important to continuously reinforce and stick up for yourself and your boundaries if they are being disrespected, rather than simply letting it slide time and time again. Often, people who cross boundaries don't really mean to disrespect other people or make them uncomfortable. And, if you're around somebody who does intend to cross boundaries and wants to make other people uncomfortable, maybe you should reconsider the relationship with that person as a whole. I don't know, they don't seem like the best person to be around. And second, we must realize too that we shouldn't feel completely responsible for anyone other than ourselves. Mental health writer Jack Nolan states that often people overstep boundaries because they think they know better for the other person's life. They may have a genuine desire to help, but they may step on the other person's boundaries to do that. Like my dad, for example, who constantly pushes me into photo opportunities because he thinks I'll regret it later if I don't take them now. Spoiler alert, haven't really regretted any photo opportunities I rejected because I felt uncomfortable. I actually regret the photo opportunities I did get pressured into taking because now I get uncomfortable anytime remembering those memories. Sorry, Dad. A more classic and slightly more extreme example of this would be helicopter parenting. So parents, please be notified that your duty doesn't include making your child uncomfortable in the name of caring for them by disrespecting their boundaries. This includes, but is not limited to, forcing your child to share their social media passwords if they are uncomfortable and have told you that they're uncomfortable. Forcing them to let you see all their private messages if they've also told you that they're uncomfortable with it. And also insisting that they're ungrateful if they don't share every single detail of every minute of every day with you. The truth is, as therapist, author, mental health writer, Terry Kozlowski states, it's no one's responsibility to make you happy. Just like you're not responsible for anyone else's happiness. And my dad's gotten better too about realizing that when I say no to a photo opportunity, it's not an opportunity to play the how many times do I have to ask her before she says yes game. It just means no. I realize that it is difficult for him, as somebody who loves taking pictures, to understand this particular boundary of mine. But not understanding a boundary shouldn't mean it's disrespected. You can not understand someone and still strive to make them comfortable. It's called caring about other people and caring for yourself, because it's not selfish at all to set boundaries. You'll find that we're a lot more carefree when we're comfortable. Thank you.
Alrighty, let me pull up the next one for us.
Do you know the competitor's number for that first one?
Yeah, the first competitor was AB102.
Okay, so we're just going as per the order on the page.
So say it again.
We are going as per the same order that they're listed on the
Oh yeah,
tab room
yes,
page.
sir.
Okay, perfect. Yep, thank you so much.
No problem. Just give me 1 second so I can type something out. Alrighty, let me open you up, put you there, and if I click Zoom, all right, can everybody see that?
Yep.
All right, let me know when you're ready.
I'm good.
Alrighty.
The year was 2018, and my younger self was scrolling through Instagram on the way to school. I saw a picture of a woman wearing an elegant pink and black xipao, or a formal Chinese gown created in the early 1900s. I stared in awe because this was the moment I finally saw myself and my culture shown in mainstream media. And who was this brave individual finally representing my culture? Well, it was Kourtney Kardashian. Yeah, the multi-million-dollar influencer and media star with zero traces of Asian background was the woman who reflected my heritage by wearing a xipao. Now, don't get me wrong, I was awed that a celebrity of such magnitude was reflecting my heritage. The thing was, if you looked at the location Kourtney tagged on her Instagram post, she was in Tokyo, Japan. The last time I checked, xipaos were native to China. Yet on Kourtney's reality TV show Keeping Up with the Kardashians, Kourtney claimed that her outfit made her look like a fun Japanese geisha. But despite many fans accusing Kourtney of wrongful representation of Japanese culture, many people defended her attempt of showing appreciation. And Kourtney isn't the only person who has faced clashing responses from the public when interacting with cultures other than their own. In fact, Shika Shrestha, an emerging media professional, puts it best in her 2019 thesis by detailing the misrepresentation of others' heritage for one's personal gain as cultural appropriation. She found with the rise of media in our everyday lives, cultural appropriation poses complicated questions of what is right or wrong, what is caring or insensitive. These opposing thoughts create what is known as a gray area, in which individuals can't evaluate cultural appropriation versus appreciation. This gray area miscalibrates our moral compass and causes conflict over deciding what actions are acceptable. So today, let's take a snapshot of how this gray area came about, then scroll through our Instagram feed to understand the effects of these moral conflicts, and finally, unlike Kourtney, we'll tag the correct location we can implement some solutions. Now, when I realized that the first time I saw someone wearing a xipao in mainstream media was because of a Kardashian wearing it in Japan, I wasn't sure whether to be proud or angry. I was glad for my culture to be represented, but Kourtney was oblivious to the roots and origin of my heritage. In fact, this occurs so often, to which James O. Young, a psychology professor at the University of Victoria, deems these actions as stylistic cultural appropriation. In other words, selectively choosing the aesthetically pleasing aspects of a culture while ignoring its history and cultural elements. For instance, in 2009, Young detailed an example of appropriation which included physically transferring possession of an artifact between cultures. Think of someone who breaks into a Mongolian temple, steals a statue of Buddha, and sells it to a European collector. Likewise, imagine someone buys a mask from an Aboriginal carver and hangs it in their living room. In both instances, this someone likely executes an action for personal gain, but one is clearly more innocuous than the other. We might think that stealing a Mongolian statue was a very drastic example, but if Indiana Jones has taught me anything, it's that stealing artifacts can make you famous. In fact, the normalization of cultural appropriation in the media, such as Indiana Jones himself, results in the negligence of cultural roots, such as where a traditional artifact originated, or why a certain culture dresses a certain way. So, what does cultural appropriation really look like? Well, it's basically the Kardashians. Truly. I mean, they're the golden example of appropriation, with Kim Kardashian in 2019 naming her lingerie brand Kimono, the word used for Japanese robes over 1,000 years ago. Or when Khloe Kardashian wore a Native American headdress as a costume for her child's birthday party. These acts of appropriation are opposed to cultural appreciation, which Greenhart defines in 2016 as striving to understand another culture, to gain a new perspective and connect with others cross-culturally. Instead, appropriation is cherry-picking what looks aesthetic and not doing enough research to understand the culture you're interacting with. So, seeing as there is such a diverse spectrum of cultural appropriation, let's scroll through our Instagram feed so we can understand the effects of these moral conflicts. Now, the gray area between cases of appropriation don't just create confusion of what's appropriation versus appreciation, but it also causes detrimental effects on marginalized communities and society as a whole. Through the lens of a multicultural individual, when someone without our cultural background appropriates our traditions without understanding the roots of our culture, it creates harsh stereotypes. According to Elizabeth Burns, Rosemary Coombe, and Fiona Mackerelt in 2009, appropriation causes people to illustrate cultural practices in a context that distorts its meaning and makes it difficult for cultural individuals to interpret their own identities. With Kourtney mixing a Chinese qipao in a Japanese setting, I had to rethink if I knew my culture well enough. For someone who might be exploring their Chinese heritage at a young age, seeing a formal qipao being worn with bright neon eyeshadow and a fluffy scarf, which Kourtney did, only convolutes the true meaning of one's cultural clothing and origins. In the end, appropriation causes people to clump together various traditions, and it waters down the true meaning of one's culture all for the sake of vanity. This is further perpetuated by the media because it's common for important information to get stripped from stories and events when being posted. For example, we can look back to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where Jones and his fellow explorers encounter savage Indians who eat live snakes and remove people's hearts. In 2020, cultural writer Saffron Maeve wrote how this scene only perpetuated the myth of savage Hindus, all for the sake of a cinematic narrative. It allowed a multi-billion-dollar franchise to profit off of stereotypes without regarding the cultural community itself. The Indian government even rose concerns about its offensive script that disregarded cultural accuracies because the film was being produced in India. But instead of rethinking the plot, the production only moved its filming location. This only caused further harm towards culture, communities, and society as a whole because it was a lost chance at educating someone, and society was left with a false, stereotypical view of Hindu culture. These constant conflicts, whether an internal identity clash or an external stereotypical clash, make it difficult for every individual to interpret how to truly appreciate one's culture. So as we understand how cultural appropriation and its gray area harm marginalized communities and society as a whole, it's imperative that we, unlike Kourtney, tag the correct location we can implement some solutions. Now, if we were to outline clear guidelines of cultural appropriation versus appreciation, a large majority would be satisfied. They'd have relief of knowing they were in the clear by a simple "that is okay, that is not." But treating cultural appropriation like an issue we can solve with hard and fast rules only ignores the complexities and nuances that exist. So instead, we have to hone this gray area to a more personal standpoint. First, looking at the perspective from the public eye, it's crucial that we take the opportunity to learn whenever we can. For example, in Hong Kong, a woman named Pandora Chung owns a Xipao rental store aimed to give tourists an immersive perspective of Chinese culture. However, she reported that many people refused to even enter her store in fear of offending others. This is why the most important thing for cultural outsiders to do is listen to what members of a cultural community tell you about how to wear one's clothes or how to act respectfully within a context. It's important to not be afraid to appreciate a culture because you're afraid you'll get called out for appropriating it. Many individuals, including myself, love to share our culture. So the first step to truly broadening one's perspective is all about research and communication. Researching looks like examining whether a cultural garment is sacred or not. Because if a clothing item, like a xipao, was mainly meant for formal wear as opposed to religious reasons, you'll be able to properly interact with it without invalidating its cultural origins and history. In other words, always examine the magnitude of one's actions in order to prevent situations from being blown out of proportion and causing unnecessary conflict. So don't worry, your caffeine addiction is safe and you can keep your espresso maker because you likely are not appropriating Italian culture. Instead, whenever seeing depictions of various cultures in the media, such as in Indiana Jones or even in a singer's music video, ask yourself, is this truly a reliable source of information for learning about other cultures? Oftentimes, it's not, so you can turn to members of a cultural community to learn about personal experiences, whether through friends or through family. Visit websites and read articles written by cultural groups and individuals who aim to share their culture with others. Ultimately, while cultural appropriation is an issue that impacts society as a whole, to enact true change, we have to focus on a more personal standpoint. So today, we've seen how cultural appropriation is prevalent in our everyday lives, both through media portrayal and a lack of research before acting. However, through its complexities, it is possible to truly appreciate one's culture without invalidating its history and cultural origins. By taking the first steps of exploring others' heritage, we can hopefully learn to share our cultural experiences appropriately. And I'm confident that we can do so without tagging the wrong location on your Instagram post. Thank you.
Alrighty, let me pull up the next one. So the next one is going to be BG100.
Thank you.
All right, just let me know when you're ready.
Yep, go for it.
Alrighty.
Over the pandemic, many Roomba owners have become close with their Roombas. In fact, maybe a little bit too close. In a study conducted by the Georgia Institute of Technology, Roombas were given to over 30 households, and after 6 months, 2/3 of the Roombas had names. In addition, when Roomba manufacturer iRobot offered to replace broken appliances, customers didn't want just any robot. They wanted their robot. If naming vacuum cleaners does not scream loneliness, I don't know what does. In a 2020 survey conducted by the University of Chicago, it was found that 80% of adults under the age of 30 reported feeling loneliness due to the COVID pandemic. What many people don't realize is that long before the COVID pandemic existed, we were already going through a loneliness epidemic. In 2017, former US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy announced that loneliness had become a public health epidemic. This epidemic, in addition to the COVID epidemic, has created a double pandemic. So today, we're first going to go through the history of loneliness and how it became an epidemic, then next analyze how it affects us, before finally looking at how it affects society as a whole before coming up with possible solutions. So let's first be clear on what loneliness actually is. Being lonely doesn't require you to be alone. Loneliness is simply just a feeling of emptiness and isolation, and can be present whether or not you have one friend or 10. Many people also think that loneliness goes back until the beginning of humanity, but it actually doesn't go back that far. Because loneliness didn't even exist in the English language before the 1800s. Back then, people lived in small, tight-knit communities and believed that having faith in God meant that you could never truly be alone. The community was seen as a source of common good, and people were forced to rely on each other in order to survive. That meant that peasants, outcasts, and widows were all taken care of, and no one was ever truly left alone. Loneliness didn't really become widespread until the Industrial Revolution, when people started feeling a strong sense of individualism amongst each other. In around 1910, urbanization, the decline of live-in servants, declining birth rates, and the replacement of the multi-generational family with the nuclear family all contributed to the trend of people living alone. Later on in the 50s, the invention of the telephone meant that family and friends could connect with each other from virtually anywhere across the country, which inspired people to move farther from each other, and in turn, more people started living alone. In the early 20th century, women were responsible for most of the household duties, like cooking and cleaning, but were also responsible for their family's social calendars, such as what parties and events they would attend. Then, in the 60s, when women started to go to work, the amount of time they had for planning family activities began to diminish at the expense of more necessary activities, like childcare and household duties. This actually contributed to the American individualistic mindset. Today, 1 in 4 Americans live alone, and that percentage is higher in certain cities. Now, in moderation, sometimes it's good to be isolated. It allows us to re-energize, reflect, and get away from annoying classmates. But when taken in large doses, loneliness can have catastrophic effects. An article in the BBC reports that prolonged social isolation can affect memory and verbal recall. Humans as social creatures were designed for social stimulation, and the effects of not having the stimulation can best be seen on a study conducted on the 9-person crew of Nouméa 3 after they emerged from a 14-month stay in the Antarctic. The effects on their brain were substantial. MRIs performed before and after the stay revealed a 7% shrinkage in areas of the brain associated with learning and memory. Daniel Rivera, a biologist at the University of Mayor in Santiago, says that physical changes to the brain, such as those associated with memory, are not as temporary as we once thought. So prolonged social isolation can impair memory function for years, and with it, our ability to connect with each other. Researchers have also found a link between loneliness and reduced levels of empathy. A 2003 study from the National Academy of Sciences placed a 3-month-old mouse under solitary confinement for 4 weeks. When the solitary confinement mouse was introduced to a newcomer, a brutal and violent fight ensued. When the newcomer entered the cage, the lonely mouse sized him up before making a startling move by getting on his back legs, rattling his tail, and then aggressively biting the intruder, wrestling him to the ground. The study concluded that the longer a mouse is isolated, the more hostile they are towards other mice. A 2019 study by King's College London found that this may be the case for humans as well. The study surveyed 2,000 18-year-olds and asked them to rate the friendliness of their neighborhood. After analyzing the questionnaires and comparing them amongst postal codes, the study found that the lonelier the person, the more likely they were to say that their neighborhood was less friendly, less trustworthy, and less cohesive. Ultimately, the study concluded that loneliness changes the way we perceive the world around us, by causing the lonely to see the world as a more threatening and hostile place. Even before the COVID pandemic, there were clear links in schools between loneliness, social isolation, and the kind of radicalization that leads to violence. In a study of 15 school shootings between 1995 and 2001, it was found that acute or chronic rejection in the form of bullying and ostracism and romantic rejection were present in all but 2 of the cases. After I went back to school for not being there for 1.5 years, my teachers joked that we didn't know how to get along anymore. There were fights constantly going on outside of lunch or outside of our classrooms. Arguments between kids who we once thought were the quietest in the class. After going back to school, when not being there for 1.5 years, I've come to realize that we are all the Antarctic researchers and mice who have suffered from social isolation, forgotten how to connect with each other, and thus we resort to hostility. Because that individualistic mindset that was once present right after the Industrial Revolution hasn't gone away. We are living in a world where everyone is competing to be better by having the most followers, getting the most college acceptances, or having the best self-image. And we're doing this by knocking each other down. Have you ever been on YouTube and noticed that videos about motivation are really just about egocentric pursuits and not community-centric pursuits? Or scrolled on Instagram and TikTok and seen the amount of attention-seeking posts from people wanting external validation? Or even just talked within a group of friends and noticed the people there that aren't there to connect with others, but are there to show off their own lives? That individualistic mindset that once started the United States has evolved into a culture consumed by egocentrism, consumerism, and materialism. We are completely worshiping the false gods of money, status, and fame, and it's hurting our relationships, and in turn causing us to have a lonelier existence. Researchers on human well-being have said that forming relationships is far more important than our own personal success could ever be. Psychologists have long known that the most important factor in happiness is the quality of our relationships. So instead of trying to build up our own list of accomplishments, we should be going out and building relationships with others. To end our loneliness epidemic, we must move from me to we. We must question mainstream cultural values and create community relationships, because not doing so could lead to serious cognitive decline and later radicalized violence. But if all of this is too much for now, we could just start by buying Roombas.
Alrighty. We're going to do pause. We're going to pull up the next one for us.
It's good.
So that was. Next one's going to be BK100, fourth speaker.
Thank you.
Alrighty, if I go up here, resume. All right. We ready?
Yep.
All right.
I was scrolling through my Instagram For You page a few days ago, as one typically in my generation tends to do on a daily, but this time I came across a rather unsettling post. It was about Earth Overshoot Day, which essentially is the day of the year when we humans use more than the Earth can produce for that year. In 2021, that day was July 29th. I thought we were making progress. I didn't want to think about how we were consuming more rather than consuming less. And worse, I didn't want to believe it. And so I immediately clicked off and tried finding something a lot happier, because that statistic made me very uncomfortable. And naturally, that's a feeling I want to avoid. But unfortunately, that was where I went wrong. We humans generally seek out the feeling of being comfortable, whether you're buying a house, building relationships, or adjusting your car seat. And just as naturally, we try our hardest to avoid the uncomfortable, whether it be avoiding a certain topic, turning off the TV when someone says something we don't agree with, or not talking to an ex-partner out of feelings of awkwardness. What seems like a harmless idea in our day-to-day lives has major consequences on large scales. Avoiding the unsettling could lead to the 21st century Fahrenheit 451, where censorship is the norm and the ability to learn ideas for what they are is hindered, because it makes people uneasy. But maybe we need to be. Maybe we need to find comfort in our discomfort. So today, let's learn how to do just that, by exploring some of the reasons people avoid negative situations, then by seeing its impacts on society, before finally coming up with the solution that makes facing the uncomfortable a little more comfortable. Now, what is being uncomfortable? Is it simply being uneasy? Is it a reaction to pressure? Are we afraid of the outcome of the present situation? Is it merely not sitting correctly in a chair? Is it us being faced with an uneasy truth? Is it our attempt to avoid controversy or being controversial ourselves? Well, you could define the idea of being uncomfortable as any one of these things and more. From being anxious to speak in public, to having someone tell you an awkward story, to waving back at someone who wasn't waving at you in the first place. One thing is common though, no matter what you may be uncomfortable about, is the desire to avoid the situation. Whether that be not talking to someone you don't see eye to eye with, or simply changing the channel anytime you disagree with something the newscaster has to report on. But why do we do this? Why is our instinct to avoid these situations so natural? Author and researcher Scott Centenaro finds that comfort is experienced in the presence of many perceived factors, such as calmness, homeostasis, lack of stress, most importantly, control. When you're comfortable and life is behaving in ways that are preferable to you, your brain can release chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, which lead to feelings and sensations that are perceived as good. Our body's positive reactions to being comfortable is the exact reason why we enjoy being in that state of ease so much, which makes us associate that feeling with good. And conversely, the negative mental and physical reactions to the undesirable are the exact reasons why we strive to avoid those situations, which makes us associate the feeling of discomfort with bad. But what happens when we as a society try too hard to stay in our realm of comfort? What happens when we begin to fight against ideas we don't like, or words that offend us? Or conversely, beginning to stop ourselves from saying the full truth in order to prevent others from feeling their own sense of discomfort. Censorship and self-censorship arguably are the societal epidemics we know as political correctness and the overuse of soft language, and is entirely based on our attempts to soften up the truth to make it more comforting for the general public to hear. This is especially prevalent in news and media sources, as according to the Pew Research Center in conjunction with the Columbia Journalism Review, about 1/4 of local and national journalists say that they have purposefully avoided newsworthy stories, while nearly as many acknowledge they have softened the tone of stories to benefit the interests of their news organizations, but more importantly, protect the well-being of the general public. And 41% admit that they have engaged in either of both of these activities. And we can easily argue that this is because of the societal denial of the truth, the controversy of the truth, or the unfiltered nature of the truth. I'm sure we all remember Ricky Gervais's 2020 Golden Globe monologue, and if you don't, it's a montage of all of Hollywood forgetting that they're on camera while being called out by one of their own in front of millions of viewers. Gervais's raw and unfiltered attacks were almost purposefully offensive. However, they were all factually accurate, making it all the more entertaining to us and all the more uncomfortable to Hollywood. But this applies beyond the big screen. Whether it's a conversation through the news or featured on The Office, the lack of soft language, which is toned down words to provide comfort where there shouldn't be, has caused people to enter into this epidemic of self-censoring. Because of this, we aren't being told the whole truth, because even journalists are afraid of the repercussions. Newscasters don't want to come off wrong, And Instagram posts now have to come with a warning. Because society has proven that the truth is too unsettling, it is being altered, withheld, and censored to provide us a sense of comfort. And that is dangerous. So how do we combat this issue? Not to be corny, but the change begins with us. After all, we are that society that we like to so highly criticize. And in order for society to grow, we as individuals must grow first. How? We can first challenge ourselves to embrace and appreciate the controversial, understand why something may be perceived that way, whether it's a result of conflicting beliefs or the attempt to deny a truth that is difficult to accept. And if that situation makes you uncomfortable, it probably should. Which leads us to the second solution. Understand that some topics should make you uncomfortable. My friend's AP World History teacher skipped over talking about genocides because it made him too tense, which is a clear example of someone trying to avoid a difficult subject, but more or less deny his students the truth. Genocides and situations alike should make you uneasy, because the nature of the situation shouldn't make you feel at bay. This discomfort in learning about these painful experiences means that we are taking in the information as it happened, not in a way that shelters us from the truth. Finding discomfort should be a good indicator in the lack of censorship on a topic, which means a greater amount of factual truth. And third, and finally, we need to know and understand the great impacts of censorship. Whether it's small scale, such as using soft language in a conversation with a friend to avoid a negative reaction, or large scale, where society is pressuring journalists to withhold necessary yet uncomfortable information to protect their image, that is still information deliberately being withheld from us. And this should not be taken lightly. By trying to keep society trapped in their bubble of comfort, we are costing them the reality of many situations, both domestically and internationally, which leads us to have a skewed perception of what is actually going on in the world, which is dangerous. And just as I was in denial about the post that I saw on Instagram, I realized that that was because that information happened to be uncensored. I was uncomfortable knowing this truth, but right here, right now, I find comfort that I felt the sense of uneasiness. And now I'm trying to expose myself to more information that doesn't leave me feeling happy or calm. And I encourage you to do the same. Growth, whether personal or societal, is experienced in the uncomfortable, the anxious, the uneasy, and the stressed. Whether it be personal development or so far as societal change, growing to appreciate unfiltered information, uncensored ideas, or even difficult subjects makes embracing the uncomfortable even easier, because now we've learned to accept the fact that we are being told the whole truth. Today, we found out why humans like this sense of relief, because it leaves us in an appeased state. Then we explored the consequences of this state on a larger scale, the epidemic of self-censoring and the withholding of truth. And finally, we found ways that we as individuals can impact the societal collective in embracing our discomfort. We as a society have to eliminate this idea of comfort being good and discomfort being bad, to eliminate the threat of miring in the easy, or startling statistics and heartbreaking events will become hidden to protect our solace. We cannot allow ourselves to fear the truth. Rather, we should allow ourselves to find the uncomfortable truth a little more comforting.
All right. Let me get the next one up for us. Ready. The next one, speaker 5, is BC 102.
Thank you.
All righty. Zoom share. All right, we all good?
Yep.
All right. Cameron Kahn, you good? All right.
My name is Madeline Rowley, and this is my original oratory, The How, Why, and What of Conformity. In 2016, a social experiment was conducted in the waiting room of a doctor's office. Actors lined the room, posing as everyday patients, and they waited for real subjects to come inside. As the first real woman entered, they proceeded with the experiment. Intermittently, a loud beep would play over the intercom, and all of the actors would briefly stand up and sit back down. After watching this happen just 3 times, the woman started to copy the actions of the actors, standing up along with them. As more real subjects continued to come into the room, the actors started to file out one by one, slowly leaving a room of legitimate and compliant people, who, as each of them came in, would eventually start to comply with the actions of the rest of the group, standing up and sitting back down after hearing a beep. After a while, one of the participants was recorded saying to someone next to them, "Why are we standing up?" The response? "I don't know, I just did it because everyone else was doing it." This is a psychological principle known to many of us as conformity, defined by Britannica as the process whereby people change their beliefs, actions, or perceptions to more closely match those to the groups to which they belong or the groups which they desire the approval of. Today, we're going to be examining the how, why, and what of conformity by discussing 3 things. 1, we will discuss the psychology behind why this phenomenon is able to occur. 2, we will discuss its consequences in our everyday lives. And 3, we will discuss how we can avoid falling prey to its negative effects while learning to use it to our advantage. According to simplypsychology.org and the majority of psychologists around the world, people conform for 2 main reasons. The first type of conformity is called normative influence, where you comply because you want to fit in with a group, hence the root word normal. Since the creation of Instagram in 2010 and the creation of TikTok in 2016, we've seen this phenomenon in full effect as influencers and creators set off skyrocketing trends that seemingly everybody else in the world tends to follow. This starts a snowball effect, where the more people we see in a group, the more we want to be in the group. Conformity is the root of why trends are able to occur in the first place. However, it's easy to get swept up in the power of the group so much that our basic individuality becomes something we want to cover up. The second type of conformity is called informational influence, where you comply due to a belief that the group is better informed than you are. This one is a little more rare, a little more dangerous, and a little more relevant. The second you start leaning away from whether comfy clothes or cute clothes are preferable, you start getting into topics that are more political and more information-based. Our idealization of these political figures and these influencers tends to lead us to the belief that they have all the correct opinions. Through this train of thought, radical activism, bandwagon political beliefs, and cancel culture are all enabled through the belief that if millions of other subscribers and followers are doing it, it must be accurate. This leads us now to pose the question, what's the threat? Weren't these original examples just actors in a doctor's office? And while I too don't think that any of us are going to end up in experimental situations in our waiting rooms, conformity affects our everyday situations a lot more than we might be realizing. A study done in 2014 by the American Psychological Association reported that those who have high rates of smoking also have higher rates of smoking friends. Those with higher rates of smoker friends also reported that they found it much harder to quit if they were able to at all. Additionally, they tended to think much more positively about smoking and less at all about its negative effects. In a 2016 study done by the European Journal of Criminology, they found that those with delinquent friends were much more likely to commit crimes than those with non-delinquent friends. Additionally, they were also less likely to report bullying or abusive behavior relative to the amount of time that they consistently spent with those friend groups. And finally, a 2014 study done by Vertigan found that immigrants who adapt through integration or assimilation are received much more positively by their peers than those who are not. Isn't this just a matter of us wanting to conform with those that we are similar to and refusing to spend time to those whom we are not? In this way, we can see that conformity is an inevitable threat that affects all of us simply because we cannot step outside of our comfort zones. Notice that word that I just used, inevitable. Conformity, and this is an uncomfortable principle, is unavoidable. Why is it unavoidable? We are tribal creatures. We want to be familiarized. We want to be recognized. We want to be validated in these groups that we spend our time with. But I like to have control over my thoughts, and I'm sure you like to have control over your thoughts. So surely there must be a way that we can use it to our advantage. As luck would have it, there is. I'm going to present 3 character traits that we should be striving to exemplify in the hope that when others inevitably conform to us, it will at least make the world a better place. Our first focus trait is optimism. This one speaks for itself. Life is a lot easier when we're on the bright side. Cynical and pessimistic attitudes are draining on us, the mental health of others around us, and everyday actions. When we are optimistic, we tend to look for the bright side, our mental health increases, and we are able to positively affect those around us. So let optimism be a high priority when working to change your mindset. Our second focus quality is being able to disagree. If I have opinions and I choose to only spend time with people who share those exact opinions, I will spend the rest of my life in a bubble, unable and unwilling to change. But by being willing to disagree respectfully, I'm able to practice what I preach and utilize those open-minded and anti-conforming methods that I am so striving to advocate. And our last focus quality is hardworking. Our society and many societies around the world typically prioritize results over work. In this way, I am asking you to break away from the conformity and start prioritizing work over results. I'm not asking you to have the highest GPA. I'm not asking you to have the most promotions at your work. I am asking that regardless of GPA or promotions, you work hard, you give 100%, and you remain diligent and honest. These 3 principles and these 3 focus traits can be highlighted using a basic metaphor. In the 1960s, scientists, botanists to be specific, conducted a test in which they grew 2 sets of the exact same plant, with every confounding variable identical except for the music, which the vegetation were exposed to 24/7. In one group, the scientists played discordant rock music, and in the other group, classical and pleasant jazz. As you might have guessed, in the first group, the plant showed signs similar to that of overwatering and twisted away from the speakers. In the second group, the plants grew rapidly, showed strong signs of health, and twisted towards the speakers. In that way, our thoughts, our actions, and our traits that we are choosing to exemplify can have so much more of an effect on others than we might be realizing. Even down to the basics of music on plants, our traits affect others. So I highly encourage us that as we try to use conformity to our advantage, that we work on these traits that we know will help the lives of others, and that we might be able to use it to our advantage. Now, before I leave, let me exemplify and emphasize the one thing that I truly want you to get out of this. Uniqueness is not a bad thing. In fact, it's far from it. The differences in our population are what makes up culture, our heritage, and our ways of life. The beauty of our individuality cannot be recognized until we're not scrambling to be like everybody else. Of course, it's easier said than done. But when you leave here today, I encourage you to follow the advice of Robert Frost when he said, 2 roads diverged in a wood. And I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
All right. Let me pause this and get the next one out.
No.
The next and final speaker is going to be speaker 6 with the code AC100.
Perfect.
That one. All righty, just let me know when y'all are ready.
Yep. Go for it.
Yep. All right. What about you, Cameron? All righty. Mute myself.
When I was younger, I always got so excited to have pancakes for breakfast. I saw those satisfying videos of fluffy, stacked pancakes dressed with glistening syrup. The cook would take one bite of this creation and be inspired. My stomach was inspired. I woke up early to make the batter and plated each semi-circular cake with a splash of maple syrup. Little did I know that 2 minutes after plating my glorious stack of pancakes, they would be deflated, soggy, and sickly sweet after absorbing all of that maple syrup. I felt lied to. But on my journey to create the perfect pancake, I discovered some shocking news. Have you ever seen those videos where they show you how food in commercials is prepared? Like for pancakes, they use motor oil instead of syrup because motor oil won't absorb in the pancakes and make them look soggy on screen. Duh, why didn't I think of that? For cereal, they use glue in place of milk, soap and beer for added foam, hairspray on fruit for shine. I mean, the list of life-threatening substances being used for food commercials goes on, all for aesthetics. Luckily, I had parents who kept the motor oil out of reach, and I was quickly taught that some things are just too good to be true. And in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and recent protests, it becomes apparent that these toxic techniques aren't limited to food. The use of Black trauma for the gain of people and corporations is nothing new. But since the recent deaths of Black people by police brutality, the capitalization on these issues has reached all new heights. The rush of support and concern around the Black Lives Matter movement was wonderful, inspiring. But now that the cameras have stopped rolling, you see it was all fake. And what you thought was an ally is really just a mouthful of flapjacks and motor oil. Disappointing, bitter, and possibly life-threatening. So today, let's dissect how this illusion is created. First, we'll bring light to the issue of performative activism. Next, we'll use our camera to zoom in on its dangers. And finally, we'll take action to combat the performers. First, let's bring light to the issue of performative activism. As stated in an article from the Oxford Blue about fake corporate social justice, Pragna Chapali states, to perform activism takes up minimal time or research during your day. Repost tweets that stand in solidarity with ethnic minorities, follow the required pages, and from there on, it's a simple copy and paste game. Before you know it, you've met the criteria to be an activist. Someone committing performative activism does not care about the cause they advocate for, and takes no tangible steps to a solution. Performative allyship is done by people, corporations, and schools alike. While families are mourning their loved ones who lie victim to police brutality, companies are getting a quick buck. The truth is, Black people have been dying at the hands of police officers since the police force was the runaway slave patrol. But now everyone's paying attention? You can say Black Lives Matter and not really live it, not really mean it, because you can say anything. I could say I'm getting a private jet, and sure, for a day or two, I'd have a lot of new friends and a lot of new praise. But saying it doesn't make it true. So it won't take long for all of those new friends to disappear and forget about me. These people, these corporations, have no intention in participating in the Black Lives Matter movement. But when they utter those 3 words, Black Lives Matter, they get praise, sales, and the chance to manipulate those who actually care. I've gone to a predominantly white school since I was 5 years old, which means my surroundings, consciously or not, have altered the way I am and the way I viewed myself. And I'm not saying that for pity, it's just a fact. So when my peers from school get on Instagram and repost Black Lives Matter, I find it a little hard to believe. Because saying those words doesn't only mean you are against police brutality. It also means that you will protect Black lives in all capacities. So when you say Black Lives Matter, but you ask a Black girl in your class if she's a Blood or a Crip based on her skin tone, it seems a little contradictory. When you take pictures at a protest but make fun of natural Black features, and stare at me when my hair is out, say the N-word on the regular, call Black women men, make cotton-picking jokes in class, I find it a little hard to believe you're not putting on a show. We see an example of this performative activism in corporations, when L'Oreal Paris is called out for its disingenuous allyship. On June 1st, L'Oreal shared a post to Instagram with a black square with the words, "Speaking out is worth it," stating that L'Oreal Paris stands in solidarity with the Black community and against injustice of any kind. Though Monroe Bergdorf, a previous L'Oreal model, responded to L'Oreal's post detailing the hypocrisy of L'Oreal's words. L'Oreal dropped Bergdorf from their True Match diversity campaign in 2017 following her remarks discussing white privilege and ignorance. So let me get this straight. Not only did L'Oreal Paris capitalize off the trauma of millions for the chance at new customers, but they also kicked a Black woman off of their diversity campaign for speaking out about ignorance and white privilege, only to later claim that they stand in solidarity with the Black community. It's absurd. We see the same questionable behavior by Starbucks, who will proudly say Black Lives Matter, but also profit off prison labor, a form of modern-day slavery which disproportionately impacts the Black community, as we are often targeted by police and given harsher sentences. At the end of the day, Starbucks wants to sell coffee. L'Oreal wants to sell makeup. And they'll say whatever they need to make that happen. Because capitalizing on Black trauma to get what you want is the tradition of America. So now that we've shed light on the problem of performative activism, let's use our camera to zoom in on some of the terrible implications it has on our society. To be an activist today is more about saying and less about action. And that is dangerous. Exhibit A, Blackout Tuesday. The trend Blackout Tuesday emerged after the deaths of several Black people by police brutality in the summer of 2020. This trend of replacing your profile with a black square, while innocent on the surface, was my own personal motor oil pancake. At best, it served as a tool wielded by those who use Black trauma for their own gain, and at worst, it actually flooded the Black Lives Matter feeds, making it impossible for important information to get out to protesters. Also, it did absolutely nothing to help. The hashtag now stands at 28.9 million, while the number of people who actually signed the petition to bring justice to George Floyd stands at 17 million. That's a difference of 12 million people. With so many performers, the number of allies supporting a movement is always inaccurate, causing false hope and poisoning movements. So finally, let's take action to combat the performers. When trying to make real change, you're going to come across a lot of disingenuous people. But there's always ways to prevail. This is what we're going to do. We're going to use my 3P system. The first P is to donate, or pay. For the Black Lives Matter movement specifically, I know that there are several memorial funds to donate to, like the fund for Kevin Peterson Jr., Walter Wallace, Daunte Wright, Rashad Brooks, Breonna Taylor, and so many more. There are also organizations to donate to, like the Fund for Black Newspapers that showcase Atlanta Voice and the Houston Defender, which are both newspapers that showcase Black authors and also Black youth that are starting out writing. We can also use the second P, which is protest. If you want to, do it. And I don't mean just show up to take pictures and leave. I mean, if you're a white ally standing at the front lines and protecting Black people behind you that are more likely to be shot at, use your privilege with the police for good. After the death of George Floyd, I actually went to a protest at Fairfax, and I wasn't able to protest because of how dangerous it was, and my parents didn't want me to be in the front lines. So what I ended up doing was passing out snacks, passing out first aid, milk for tear gas, and just generally helping out the protesters in any way I can. Protesting doesn't always mean putting your life on the line. Sometimes it means just assisting where you can. The last P is to prepare. And you can prepare by educating. Educate yourself and others. If you say Black Lives Matter, or even if you don't, learn about systemic racism and how the justice system severely targets Black youth. Learn about the school to prison pipeline. As I said, there are multiple newspapers elevating Black voices that you can read up on for personal accounts. There's also research to do on your own. Remember, it's not the burden of every Black person to educate you, but those that will, you should listen to. Now that we've shown light on performative activism and used our camera to zoom in on its dangers, we can take action using the 3 Ps: protest, pay, or prepare, so we can finally address the mess behind the curtain.
All right. That was the last one, so I'm going to unshare my screen. Bring it back here. Alrighty, I'm going to mute myself. Alrighty, I have my ballot stuff filled out. If I click end, it's just gonna kick us all out of this Zoom call. Y'all fine with that?
Yep.
All right, cool.